Welcome to Innovations and Breakthroughs with your host, Rich Goldstein, talking about the evolutionary, the revolutionary, the inspiration and the perspiration, and those aha moments that change everything. And now, here's your host, Rich Goldstein.
Rich Goldstein here, host of the Innovations and Breakthroughs podcast, where I feature top leaders and the path they took to create change. Past guests include Roland Frazier, Ryan Dice, and Ilko de Beer. This episode is brought to you by my company, Goldstein Patent Law, where we help you to protect your ideas and products. We've advised and obtained patents for thousands of companies over the past 25 years. So if you're a company that has software, a product, or a design you want protected, go to goldsteinpatentlaw.com, where there are amazing free resources for learning about the patent process. And you could email my team at welcome@goldsteinpc.com to explore if it's a match to work together. You could also check out the book I wrote for the American Bar Association that explains in plain English how patents work. It's called the ABA Consumer Guide to Obtaining a Patent. I have here today Howard Getson. Howard is the founder and CEO of Capitalogix. It's a data science company that uses advanced AI to maximize performance in real time. He also runs a hedge fund that's powered by the Capitalogix platform. Howard's prior company, Intelligent Control, if I said that correctly, was on the Inc. 500 list. Howard speaks at industry events across the globe. He holds an MBA and a JD from Northwestern University, and he lives in Dallas with his wife and 4 dogs. It's my pleasure to welcome Howard Getson. Welcome, Howard. Thanks for being here.
Hey, it's terrific being here. It's good to see you again.
Yeah, you too. And it's funny, I got to talk a little bit with your son, Zach, earlier, and I noted to him that in that bio, he was not included, but he mentioned the fact that neither him or his brother live at home with you.
Well, it's nice. They grew up, they went to school, and after Zach came home from college, he did live with us for a while. So I'm glad he no longer lives with us and has moved on to bigger and better things, even though he does work at the company, which is good as well.
Yeah. And how is that working together with your son?
I think it's interesting. When I deal with my mother, that's probably the worst behaved I ever am. Nothing turns me into a 13-year-old boy quicker than dealing with my mother. And I thought about it, and it's because she knows where all the buttons are because she installed them. And I suspect the same is true for him. But he thinks that I installed the buttons.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I love that phrase, is that the reason that your parents push your buttons is because they installed them. And it's really true. It's like all of the things that bother us really go back to childhood anyway, right?
Yeah. The nice thing about having him here is he does marketing for us, and he's responsible for a lot of the content. So I write a weekly commentary, and he does the first draft, and so much of it is written so close to my voice that I know that as a parent, I've transferred a lot of the lessons or the thinkings that I really wanted to. And proof is every week when I get this back and I'm like, wow, that was really well done. Or, he said that better than I would have. And I think that's one of the best compliments that you get as a parent is when you see your kid surpass you. It's terrific.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's kind of funny. It's like we think that we pass our DNA on to our children. In essence, we though pass kind of like a DNA of our personalities and our habits and the way we do things onto them too.
Yeah. And it's not only the lessons of what's right, it's the examples of what they choose not to be. I have 2 sons and they couldn't be more different. My older son, Ben, is involved in product management for a public company in San Francisco, and in many respects, he's very intellectual. But if I had to summarize his personality, it's a phrase: less is more. Now, Zach is also intelligent, but in a very different way. He's emotionally intelligent. But if I had to characterize his personality, it's I want all of everything. And it's really very interesting that they both came from the same household and the same 2 parents.
Yeah, it is interesting. And I guess I could reflect similarly on my children as well. So something that struck me in your bio and something that you mentioned before about the JD, and I guess it must have escaped me. I mean, maybe we talked about it, maybe I forgot, but you were a lawyer.
I don't self-identify as a lawyer, though.
I try not to either.
So I'll tell you kind of a funny story. I went to Duke University undergrad, and I went there thinking that I was going to be an athlete. And so I wanted to play football and track. Very quickly, I had knee surgery and hand surgery and figured out that I was not destined for stardom in Division I, especially when you play teams like Ohio State, Clemson, and the University of Miami. I did make all conference in shot put for 2 years and then stopped. But I graduated college in 2.5 years. And then I got my MBA and law degree in 2.5 years. I was done at 23. And so I moved to Dallas, started practicing law right before I turned 24. And I ended up making partner and looking in the mirror one day and realizing that this can't be what I worked so hard for. It was interesting because I really envied my clients who were entrepreneurs, and I really didn't enjoy the people who I worked with who happened to be lawyers. But it makes total sense because my clients were entrepreneurs and my partners were lawyers. And
so was that the biggest factor of it that you didn't like when you looked in the mirror and you saw what was going on? It was the people that you were surrounded by?
It's actually the culture. It's the mindset. Because as I think objectively about what's made me me, law school was not fun, but it's probably one of the most useful disciplines that I've ever been through. It was about critical thinking and better writing and understanding how mechanisms work. And I really think it's extraordinarily similar to what a coder does when they're thinking about an algorithm or writing little pieces. But I think that way very naturally. And I actually really do self-identify with that form of analytical thinking. I'm extraordinarily energized by thinking, writing, learning. I read just ridiculous amounts of things. And these are all things that, let me score high on the tests that get you into law school or do well on law school tests. But what I didn't like was the culture of a law firm where it wasn't so much a meritocracy as it was measuring how many hours you worked and billed and what percent of those you had to credit back to a client and how well you followed orders. I believe in structured thinking. I love forms and tools, but I hate structured thinking if it doesn't allow you to be creative. When the form is the structure that enables creativity, that's terrific. But when the form sucks the creativity out, that's horrible.
Right. So when the form is a constraint rather than creating a framework for freedom, then that's no fun.
Yeah. And by the way, that's why I love Strategic Coach. Dan Sullivan and Strategic Coach have done an incredible job of creating a series of really simple tools or forms that you can use again and again because you're not the same and your business isn't the same, but those thoughts are useful regardless of who you are or where you are. And it really does enable a lot of freedom. That's an example.
I love that. And by the way, Strategic Coach is probably my next move. The only thing holding me back is that these days I can't go to the in-person meeting like we could back a year ago,
It's working virtually pretty well.
Yeah. I'm big on the in-person though.
How well? Oh yeah, but that's coming back. It's coming back. I mean, this football season is going to be tough for NFL because it's going to be tough to have fans, but it's not like we're not going to go back to an NFL stadium. People are saying, "Oh, we'll never go back to big stadiums like that." Of course we will.
Right, exactly. It's all in time. By the way, I love what you said about the way you saw the law, kind of like coding. And it's funny. I've been into computers since I was a kid. It was kind of in the mid '70s. I managed to. My mother talked a college professor into allowing me to audit a computer science course, and I was 7 years old, and I got to write programs on punch cards. Punch cards. Having them fed into a computer that was miles away, because they didn't even have a computer at that college. They just had terminals. And so I was always into computers. Then I studied electrical engineering. And then patent law kind of was a natural extension of that thing that you enjoy. You talk about coding and the law. I mean, to me, patents are all about breaking things down into chunks, just like how you break a computer program down into code and subroutines, and then you maybe jump into one of those subroutines and figure out what goes in there, and then that might have a piece nested inside of that. So that's kind of part of my thinking too, which is kind of why I like patent law.
Yeah, it's frankly why I love AI. It's so easy to break down into different tiers, and if you get stuck on a problem in one of the tiers, you simply jump to a different level and make progress there. There's so much green space that it's always easy to feel like you're moving in the right direction, making progress. Actually, I've got a little piece of art in the office from Gaping Void. I know you know Jason Corman and his company.
Yes.
We have about 100 pieces of he calls it semiotics. It's meaning that's on the wall. And one of the things I wrote is energy is probably the most important thing to measure. And it's funny because we're an analytics company, and we've got 20 kind of PhD quant rocket scientist types that are busy calculating and measuring things in minute little chunks. But I still think that the best way to grow a company is with the humans, and the best thing to measure is the energy. And it's
so how do you measure that? How do you find people with the right energy?
Humans have millions of years of evolutionary biology that help us make decisions like that instinctively. I mean, I know that when there's a predator in the room, or you can walk into a room and you can tell that somebody was fighting. Even if you didn't hear any of the words, you can just feel it.
Right.
I think as you become aware, you start to recognize a really simple model. I love the use of models, and a model is something like winter, spring, summer, or fall, the daytime, nighttime, but cleansing or clogging. There are people that are cleansing or clogging. You could use it as a way to have a diet. You simply look at food and say, is this going to be cleansing or clogging? That's probably just as good as anything.
You also call it a distinction.
Sure. But in a sense, as you start to make more and more of these distinctions, you get better and better at them. So there's a concept in strategic coach called unique ability. And it looks kind of like a bullseye, where unique ability is in the middle. Outside at one is excellence. Outside that is competence. And outside that's incompetence. This is going to relate back to energy. But incompetence is easy to understand. It means even if you try hard, you're not going to meet the minimum standards.
Right.
Competence is where if you try, you can meet the minimum standards, but it's stressful because that people dumber than you, younger than you, can do it easier, and it's because it's not the right role for you. So, for example, spreadsheets are not my natural language. I can debug one, I can look and find an error in the logic, but frankly, a 23-year-old is going to do way better because they've been using it the same way that I would use a word processor or an email program.
Right.
Excellence is actually where most companies get in trouble. And this is where you do something because you have a superior skill. By the way, practicing law is one of those things for me. The distinction between excellence and unique ability is that excellence is where you have that superior skill, but it costs you energy. And in unique ability, it's where you have the superior skill, but it gives you energy. And so every day, two people do the same thing, but at the end of the day, you're willing to do a little bit more because you loved it. And then the next day you do the same thing and a little bit more, and soon you extend that edge where you're no longer competing with those people. So the reason excellence is the biggest problem in a company is that if you force people to do something because they're afraid no one else will do it, or that, you know, it's their reputation they're supposed to do it, or that it's an obligation, then it's the lost opportunity cost where they could have been doing something that they had as much skill, but it would have created more capacity because they then want to take it further, deeper. They're going to think about it at night. They're going to read about it. They're going to say, but what if I did this and what do I do about that? And if I don't see somebody extending the edge, then I worry. As they start to make progress, I want them to naturally read other books or studies. I want them to say, but what if we applied it here? Or what if we did it bigger? Or what if we did it smaller? What if we did it faster? What if we did it slower? What if instead of doing it once a week, we were able to do it once a day or once an hour? Is it possible we could do that continuously in real time? What if the result were a sensor that was used to control other things rather than the important result? And if they're not having thoughts like that, I can tell that they're doing it out of obligation or because they were told.
Right.
And so you can think of it almost as a power plant doesn't just store the power, it generates it. I don't want a battery that had to be filled and it simply depletes. I want a power plant that's self-generating. And as we create more progress and momentum, it creates more progress and momentum.
Right. You don't want to power the car with your battery. You want to jumpstart the car with the battery and then let it run.
Yeah.
And you want to plant a seed and let them develop mastery, which what you describe, integration is mastery. When you can take the DNA of one task and then you could replicate that across different areas where you might not have even thought of.
Totally agree. I mentioned Jason Corman and Gaping Void. I have two pieces of art on our wall that relate to this. And the first is bring order to the chaos. And then the second is wisdom comes from finer distinction. And in a sense, this is what I think AI does, where you take a massive amount of data or possibilities and you start to find the structure in it. Michelangelo was asked about the statue David, and somebody said, how did you do it? And he says, I chipped away at the marble until the statue appeared. The trick with bringing order to chaos is to find the order that's in it rather than bringing your own. So if I have a preconceived notion and I want to find this, it's a confirmation bias. It's actually a way to make a worse decision.
Right.
You have to be willing to find the natural order of things. It's kind of like don't fight Mother Nature. But then once you find it, then it's really easy to make wisdom from finer distinctions, because now that you understand these branches, you can figure out that these others might be there, or it's supposed to be balanced this way, or that there ought to be more layers of detail. Anyway, I think you understand the concept.
Yeah, I mean, it's about openness. It's about like being willing to have it be unknown. So that you can discover what it is rather than put your notion of what it is upon it.
Yeah. So for me, this is often apparent in decision making, and I'm going to hypertext for a second. If you watch my chin, a lower level employee is focused on what they're working on right now, maybe the next week or month. A higher level employee is focused on the next month or quarter, maybe year. A manager is capable of understanding, a year, 18 months, maybe even 3 years. And an executive is looking higher and higher up. And so it's about where your chin is. The same is true for distinctions in innovation. So much innovation is incremental, and it starts with where are we, what are we doing, and they're thinking about an agile development cycle where it's only important figure out how to get to next, and it's the minimum viable product release. But for me, a better technique is often to step away from your current situation, look at the bigger picture, and begin with the end in mind. And if you can imagine what's possible and you start to think of ways to make it more probable, not just possible, but probable, you can create milestones along the way, and you work backwards from, if I'm going to do that, then midway looks probably like this. And so in the next piece of work we're going to do, we have to get to here. And then this is where I start. Here's where I want to get to. How am I going to get there? And you're beginning with the end in mind so that you're much more aligned. But in a sense, if you commit to the result rather than the way you're going to get there, 10 times better is often easier than 10% better if you're starting from where you are and you're saying, and so what's the best next step? And what's the best next step? And what's the best next step? Doing that is exhausting. If you look at the bigger picture, it's easier to get excited. You can start to see other possibilities. And rather than going down rabbit holes of how do I make this possible, you might make that thing that you were trying to make possible irrelevant by doing it a different way. And that's where real innovation comes in.
Yeah, that's great. It's like you commit to the result, then the steps toward the result start to illuminate themselves, and anything that's inconsistent with the result also starts to show up.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you've heard quotes, journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step, or as you're climbing the staircase, you don't have to see the top, you only have to see the next step.
Right.
I look at it a little bit differently. When we're looking at something like AI or an exponential technology, so many of the things that I want to work on or that we're thinking about in the future aren't fully developed or capable of being done yet. And so we've got a model internally that looks a little bit like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And for anybody who's not familiar, at the base level, you have things like food and shelter. And then above it are things like learning and affiliation. Above that, love, and then self-actualization.
And basically the point is that you have to concentrate on the ones at the bottom first before you concentrate on what's above it, right?
Concentrate on the higher level unless the things underneath it are taken care of.
Unless you have shelter and you have food and water, you can focus on love and other things.
Right. So in terms of technology adoption, a lot of times an entrepreneur, I've got somebody who's working with us right now who's interested in using AI in a medical industry, and they're obsessed with quantum computing. But right now, one of their biggest problems is how to get data out of medical reports that come to them in PDFs from lots of different labs. And if you can't get clean data from these different sources aggregated in a place to make better decisions, you don't really need a quantum computer. You need a way to do that first thing first.
Right.
So the way I look at adoption of AI or innovation is that you start with, what do I do? As much as you want to think about those top level goals, if we come into a company and we say, so how are you going to use AI? The first thing we have to do is figure out what are the main things they already do and how are they measured? And ultimately, it's going to be broken into the people, the process, and the information. And I've got a really simple kind of rule of thumb that says, if I get the wrong result, it's either people, process, or information. You can't have the right people, the right process, and the right information with the bad result. So one of them has to change, or more than one of them has to change, but that's a beginning. Then the second step there is you start to say, all right, well, so how do I measure things? Well, a good way is to think about efficiency, effectiveness, or certainty. And so you start to create some metrics and you say, this is how I know we're making progress. And so I know that we're getting better because we're doing these things more efficiently, more effectively, more certain. Once they get to the point that they know that they're making progress, they say, what's next? And what's next is not how do you do what you're doing, but what could you do or what should you do? And really magic happens here, because this is when people realize that it doesn't have to be incremental from where they would. It's committing to a new result with a different process. And as they start to realize that this can happen again and again, it impacts their personality, their identity, and all of a sudden what they believe is possible changes.
Mm-hmm.
And stage 3 is where they express their newfound capabilities and personality by new products, new services, or new offerings that are beyond the normal competitive scope of where they used to be.
Right. And that's where breakthroughs happen, because otherwise it's just incremental. We do a bit better. We get a little bit more market share, et cetera. Now that's where real innovation happens.
Yeah. And the academic press might call it a discontiguous innovation or creative destruction, but it's the beginning of what I call industry transformation. And so what happens in that stage 3 is you send a signal to the market that says, we have a radically new capability that changes the game, right? And you may not have recognized it before, but the game has changed. And so what you have to do to stay competitive has changed. And all of a sudden, the people that used to be your competitors start to come to you and say, hey, can I start to use that tool? And instead of them trying to drown you and compete against you, it's now about collaboration. And they say, I'll give you some money, and here are some ideas, but could you make it do this? Could you make it do that? And all of a sudden, that platform really starts to transform the industry, and the cycle starts again. But that to me is what you're going to see with AI. I think that AI is going to transform the planet the way electricity did, the way the internet did, where as much as people think, oh, AI has been around for a while, people understand it. When the internet got big enough that everybody had AOL, and every magazine you got came with an AOL disk, you thought you understood the internet, but you never would have guessed that CompUSA would have gone out of business, or that record stores would go away, and that you would watch movies from your house streaming those things, and that you would buy a car like a Tesla online confidently. Just
Right.
so many things changed.
Yeah. No.
And that's what's about to happen here, where so many of my friends say, oh, AI is not going to come to my business. And, my business is more, brick and mortar rather than cyber. And it's because they don't realize that part of how AI would impact them might be dynamic pricing, or changing their supply chain, or who they advertise to, or how they deliver the product, or there are so many places that it's going to happen, and they'll say, oh, it's not going to happen. But as soon as their competitors start to use it, then they're going to realize, holy crap, I got to do something. And the interesting thing is, I used a model a while back in our talk, and I said winter, spring, summer, and fall.
I make me think of James Taylor every time you say that.
Yeah, well,
the spring, summer, fall, all you have to do is call.
Yeah, but in this case, after a winter, spring comes. But if you don't plant seeds, then it doesn't matter that they're supposed to grow in summer, and fall, you don't have a harvest. And
Right.
so even though most people would say this is springtime for AI, for companies that aren't thinking about it, or aren't thinking about how they're going to use it, it's not springtime for them. It's still winter. And their competitors are starting to plant, and they're going to start to reap the harvest. And they're going to figure out that springtime for them doesn't start until they start.
Right.
And so I think you're going to see that happen a lot.
Yep. That's very interesting. So when you have pioneers, and you have people that are doing that, are the select group that are doing the innovations, you naturally have IP, and you have patents. So what role do you see IP and patents playing in AI as it grows?
So as a patent attorney, you know how important the Alice case was, and how it impacted patents for a long time. And for those people who don't understand what I'm saying, I'll grossly oversimplify. And it got harder and harder to have a process patent. But if you could find a way to tie that process to a hardware or machine and how that helped you do it, then you could get your patent. That's
Yeah.
starting to loosen up again.
Yeah,
You
I mean,
agree?
I'll cast it. I think everything you said is true, and I'd put it this way: basically, there was a bad Supreme Court ruling in 2014 that all of a sudden made it difficult to get software patents because things became labeled as abstract ideas that used to be patentable. And there's a whole bunch of confusion over when something's an abstract idea and when it's not, and everything that Howard said is true about tying it to hardware as well.
But so from a realistic standpoint for the entrepreneur, it changed my patent strategy for a while. And the strategy that I basically went after was, I realized that in the beginning, it's important to get your first patent, because until you have one, you don't have one. And a lot of times people are going to say, do you have a patent? And then people say, well, I have a patent pending. But really, there's a difference between patent pending and an issued patent. So again, winter, spring, summer, and fall, you can't have your first patent until you file for one.
Right.
So if you want one, you have to start. But realistically, 1, 3, 5 patents isn't going to help you much if you're fighting an industry giant. The goal is to have a strategy so you start to acquire more, and you start to use it as currency that you use to trade for the right to use other people's patents. And at a certain point, you get enough that people would much rather do business with you so that they're protected by your patent rather than taking the risk otherwise. So what we've done, at least in my company, is we've mapped out the words that we talk about rather than the things that we do. And I want patents that are, in a sense, mile markers along the path of our talk. So I make it hard for somebody to sell against us, but I don't necessarily patent the most innovative secrets about what I do. Well, we patent things that are patentable.
Right.
But strategically along that path, and then we start to link those parts of the path together with other patents, and we continue to extend the path. I assume you understand what I'm talking about.
Yep, the IP strategy that has to do with, I mean, you're finding the critical spots where it would be valuable to have a patent, both competitively and also for relationships with other companies.
And frankly, I think that there's another benefit to patents that most people don't think about. And it's, I'll use a different analogy first. The first time you do a business plan, it's wicked hard. And you go through the whole process and you boil it down and you're wordsmithing this and working on the forecasting model. And then later you figure out the plan itself doesn't matter, but the planning was incredibly important. Mm-hmm. And what I'll tell you is the muscle that we built getting those first set of patents was really important, because we look at innovation differently and we look at protecting our innovation differently. And it's way easier for us to get a new patent now than it was, because we know what it looks like when we see it. We know it's way easier for us to identify, and we also understand what it's going to cost us, both in terms of what we pay to the lawyer, to the filing authorities, to the foreign governments when we want to get them there, but also to do the work internally to make all this happen. And we've got a pretty good idea of what each patent costs us, taking all that into consideration. And then we started to figure out, well, that means I can get this many patents per year, which really means we should aim to file this many per quarter. And that really means that we ought to meet this frequently about it. And it actually becomes part of the innovation process. And one of the ways that we grade an idea is it patent worthy? And in a sense, it sets a standard, and that standard changes, right? I mean, in a sense, your minimum viable product standard should embarrass you several years later because your standard has raised and you would never have released something like that. I suspect that your podcast now is much more polished than your first one.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, and so the same is true with something like this. And so if somebody looks at a patent as a destination, then my guess is they're probably very likely to get one and arrive at their destination. But if they look at it as part of a journey, then I think it will actually increase the value of the rest of their journey.
I love that. And all of this was fantastic. I really appreciate it. Howard, if people want to learn more about you or get in touch with you, how would they go about doing that?
Yeah. Our website is capitalogix.com, capitalogix.com. My email address is hgetson@capitalogix.com. And if you send me an email and tell me you want to get on our weekly commentary for your listeners, I'll do it for free, no cost whatsoever. There's no selling. And every week I write 3 pieces about strategy and business. But I also have 25 links that are kind of lighter, related to business and technology, and 25 that are related to markets and business. So it's I will tell you that it's a very well received newsletter. Just send me an email at hgetson@capitalogix.com. Again, HGETSON @CAPITALOGIX.com. Tell me you want the weekly commentary. You saw this at Rich Goldstein's podcast, and I'm happy to send it to you. And that's a great way to do it. There's a blog there as well that's worth looking at. But
that's
really
awesome. You know, I didn't know about the newsletters. I'm going to take you up on that as well.
Yeah, it's good. I promise. So.
I know it. I'm quite sure of that. So again, Howard, thanks so much for being here. Hopefully I'll get to see you again in person when events start happening again. But once again, thanks for taking the time today to be on the show.
All right. Thanks again. Appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Innovations and Breakthroughs with your host, Rich Goldstein. Be sure to click subscribe, check us out on the web at innovationsandbreakthroughs.com, and we'll see you next time.